This is Tyler. Welcome back. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for joining me on this journey and adventure. In our last episode, we dove deeply into the quest for personal identity, exploring the profound dimensions of free will and agency, understanding the crucial roles of intention and interests, aligning ourselves with our personal logos, embracing the middle way of balanced thinking, and finally integrating Viktor Frankl's powerful framework of truth, love, and consciousness, or at least my interpretation of it. Ultimately, we found that identity formation isn't simply an internal journey, it's a profound interaction between ourselves and the world around us. Today, we're moving outward. Having explored who we are at the core, we're now going to shift our lens to how we connect to others, to our families, to our broader communities, and even to something transcendent beyond ourselves. This marks the beginning of part 3 in our series, where our focus expands from the existential and the individual to the collective. In this episode, we'll start by examining the very foundations of relationship itself. We'll clearly define what a relationship fundamentally is, examining the key elements that make connections meaningful and significant. We'll explore how relationships exist at multiple levels, from the most basic physical interactions to deep emotional and even spiritual connections. We'll then highlight family and parenting as the initial and perhaps most influential forms of human relationship, shaping not just who we are, but how we relate to everyone and everything around us. We'll examine how love and emotional fluency plays crucial roles in enriching our relationships, enabling us to communicate, connect, and flourish. And finally, we'll explore the intriguing possibilities of a transcendent relationship, something greater than ourselves, something spiritual or even divine, and reflect on what that means for our understanding of meaning and purpose. Before we dive in, I'd like you to consider something deeply personal. What are the core relationships in your life? And how have those relationships shaped your understanding of who you truly are? Keep this question in mind as we explore together today, because the relationships we build and nurture, whether family, friends, community, or something transcendent, are fundamentally intertwined in our sense of self, meaning, and fulfillment. And so, with that, let's begin at the beginning, the definition of relationship itself. What exactly do we mean by the term relationship? At its most fundamental layer, a relationship is simply about connection, the state of being linked, connected, or associated in some meaningful way. But connection is deeper than it first appears. Let's unpack it by clearly looking at 3 foundational components that make up all relationships. First and foremost, a relationship requires at least 2 distinct entities. Without at least 2 separate entities, there's nothing for one to relate to or interact with. These entities can be obvious, like 2 people in a conversation, or more subtle, like different versions of yourself across time, such as your present self relating to your future or past self. For example, think about a relationship with your past self. When you reflect on decisions you made years ago, you often engage in kind of a dialogue with your younger self. You're relating across time, connecting your current wisdom with your past experiences. The second essential component is interaction or influence. In every relationship, entities influence, affect, or act upon one another in some meaningful way. This interaction might be deliberate and conscious, like friends supporting each other during difficult times, or unconscious and natural, like the Earth and the Moon affecting each other through gravitational pull. For instance, take gravity itself. The Earth and the Moon don't consciously decide to connect, yet they remain locked in a continual dance, influencing tides, weather, and even life itself. Similarly, even without conscious intent, your mood can unconsciously affect other people around you, subtly shaping their emotional states. The third component of relationships is the recognition or awareness of connection. While not strictly necessary, after all, the Earth doesn't consciously recognize its relationship with the Moon, this recognition profoundly enriches our connections. Being aware of the relationship we have with another entity adds cognitive, emotional, and even spiritual layers of meaning. For example, consider your closest friendship or romantic relationship. Simply being consciously aware of the bond you share deepens its meaning and significance. The acknowledgement that we are connected transforms interactions from merely incidental to intentional, valued, and meaningful exchanges. Let's take a practical example to weave these three elements together. Imagine two friends are sharing coffee. First, there are two entities, the two friends. Second, they interact, sharing ideas, laughter, or encouragement, actively influencing each other's emotional states. Finally, there's a clear recognition of connection. Both friends consciously value and acknowledge their bond, deepening its meaning. But relationships extend beyond just human to human connections. Your relationship with nature, for instance, follows the same rules. You are one entity, and nature, the forest, the oceans, animals, is another. There's a constant interaction through breathing air, eating food, drinking water, and there can be profound awareness of this interconnectedness that creates deeper meaning, appreciation, and care. As we mentioned earlier, you even have relationships with yourself across time. Past decisions influence your present opportunities, and awareness of this relationship allows you to shape your future more intentionally. Understanding these foundational elements of relationship helps us to recognize just how pervasive and essential relationships are truly in our lives. We are constantly embedded in a web of connections, some conscious and intentional, others subtle and unnoticed, yet all profoundly shaping who we become. Now, having clearly defined the foundational nature of relationships, let's move deeper, exploring different layers of connection, from physical and biological relationships to emotional and even spiritual bonds. The first and foremost basic layer is the physical relationship, interactions rooted purely in laws of physics and forces. For example, we consider the relationship between the Earth and the Sun, their gravitational interaction, though completely unconscious, profoundly influences the seasons, climates, and ecosystems. Without this fundamental physical relationship, life as we know it simply wouldn't exist. And building upon physical relationships, we arrive at the next layer, biological relationships. These connections emerge from shared genetics, survival, or biological interdependence. A clear and powerful example here is the relationship between a parent and child. This connection is not just physical, it's biologically coded within us, influencing behaviors, emotional bonds, and even our basic survival instincts. And moving deeper, we come to cognitive relationships. These relationships are defined by awareness, recognition, and perception of another entity's existence. For example, when you meet someone new, your brain instantly categorizes and processes them as another human being. This cognitive recognition sets the stage for communication, cooperation, or competition, guiding how we interact, collaborate, and coexist in a social world. And even deeper than that, and more nuanced, are emotional relationships. Connections defined by feelings, trust, intimacy, and attachment. This layer brings meaningfulness into focus through bonds like friendship, romantic love, and familial care. Emotional relationships are central to our lives, guiding how we experience joy, sorrow, love, and belonging. But emotional relationships are also complex, especially in our modern world. Think about the emotional connection you might develop with a podcast host or even AI companion. These relationships can be one sided. You experience emotional connection, validation, and companionship, even if the other party doesn't consciously or emotionally reciprocate. Yet, despite their asymmetry, these relationships can provide genuine emotional comfort, inspiration, and fulfillment. For example, when you listen to a long form podcast regularly, you become a part of an intimate conversation. You form a meaningful connection with the host or guests, despite them never meeting you or knowing you personally. Similarly, interactions with advanced AI tools like ChatGPT or personalized digital assistants can evoke feelings of genuine companionship, even though the AI doesn't truly feel anything back like a living being. So finally, we reach the most abstract yet profound meaningful layer, spiritual or transcendental relationships. These connections transcend the physical, biological, cognitive, and even emotional dimensions. They're metaphysical. They're rooted in our search for meaning, purpose, and connection with something greater than ourselves. Whether you view this through a religious lens, such as a relationship with God, or a more universal lens, such as connection to the universe, nature, or the pursuit of the highest good, these relationships can transform our lives profoundly. In this sense, the transcendent relationship isn't limited by tangible interaction or direct emotional reciprocity. It's about the profound personal experience of awe, wonder, and meaningful alignment with something infinitely larger. Consider the way that you feel when you're deeply connected to nature, during an awe inspiring sunset, or experiencing profound peace in meditation or prayer. These moments represent spiritual relationships, anchoring us in purpose, clarity, and meaningful existence. Now, having explored these foundational layers of relationships, let's turn now to examine one of the most significant relationships we experience first and foremost: the foundational relationships we form through family and parenting. The family is more than a social unit. It's the foundational crucible where all layers of relationships, biological, cognitive, emotional, and even spiritual, intersect and develop. From the moment we enter the world, family relationships form our initial blueprint for connection and interaction with the broader world. Central to the family is the profound and formative role of parenting. Parenting is far more than providing basic necessities like food and shelter, although those are important also. Parenting shapes our emotional landscapes, our relational capacities, our values, and our fundamental worldview. Consider for a moment how the earliest interactions with our parents or caregivers profoundly influence how we see the world. From them, we learn if the world is safe or threatening, supportive or neglectful, loving or indifferent. Our parents' actions, emotional responses, and relational styles literally shape our initial cognitive and emotional frameworks. For example, supportive and nurturing parenting, characterized by consistent love, attention, and emotional validation, helps children develop healthy attachment styles, self worth, emotional resilience, and relational confidence. They enter the world equipped with emotional stability and the trust that meaningful relationships are possible and valuable. But in stark contrast, neglectful or emotionally absent parenting, or even abusive parenting, can have severe and lasting effects. It often leaves a child with deep uncertainty, emotional confusion, mistrust, or insecurity, significantly influencing their ability to build stable and meaningful relationships through their lives. The lack of secure emotional bonds in early childhood often manifests later as difficulties in managing emotions, forming trusting relationships, or even believing in their own self worth. And this brings us clearly to the concept of emotional fluency. Now, before we dive in, it's important to clarify when I talk about emotional fluency rather than the more familiar term EQ. Emotional quotient, or EQ, is often treated as if it were an innate measure, something you either have or you don't have, much like traditional IQ. But research shows that while your IQ is stable in your early adulthood, your capacity to understand, manage, and express emotions is a skill that can be learned, practiced, and continually refined through your life. That's why I prefer the term emotional fluency. It frames emotional intelligence as a language like skill that you can develop rather than a fixed trait that you're stuck with for the rest of your life. Now, emotional fluency is like linguistic fluency. Just as mastering a language allows you to communicate your thoughts with clarity, emotional fluency empowers you to recognize your feelings, navigate complex emotional landscapes, and express your inner world with authenticity and precision. Developing this fluency enables you to connect more deeply with others, responding to life's challenges with resilience, and building relationships grounded in genuine understanding. When emotional fluency is fostered within a supportive family environment, it provides an essential toolkit for meaningful relationships. A child who learns emotional fluency early on can recognize and articulate feelings, empathize deeply with others, and maintain emotional balance even during conflicts or stress. For instance, think of a child who's consistently encouraged to express their emotions safely and openly, whether joy, sadness, frustration, or confusion. They learn how to articulate these feelings clearly, trust their emotions as valuable signals, and approach relationships with a sense of confidence and authenticity. In contrast, emotional fluency is often stunted in families where emotional expression is discouraged, ignored, or even punished. Here, individuals grow up disconnected from their own feelings, unable to clearly understand or express their emotional states because they buried them. This often results in relational difficulties, anxiety, or even a sense of isolation and nihilism. So, why is emotional fluency so critical? Well, it's because our ability to understand and express emotions doesn't just affect our individual happiness, it affects the entire fabric of our communities. Emotional fluency is essential to trust, cooperation, conflict resolution, and collective harmony. When members of a community can clearly express their emotions and empathize with others, relationships thrive. Trust is built. Conflicts become opportunities for deeper understanding rather than resentment. Communities become emotionally resilient, capable of handling challenges and nurturing individual well being. Consider your own family experience for a moment. How did your parents or caregivers influence your emotional fluency and relational styles? How has this shaped your ability to form and sustain meaningful connections in your world today? Understanding family and emotional fluency sets the stage for examining another layer of relationships, those spiritual or transcendental connections we form with something beyond ourselves, even with God. Let's explore that next. The first criteria in relating with God is straightforward. A relationship requires at least two entities. In our exploration, those entities are clear: you as an individual and God as the divine or transcendent entity. But this simplicity quickly becomes complex when we consider God's existence. For many people, God is imagined in familiar forms. This is often influenced by iconic images like Michelangelo's anthropomorphic depiction of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. However, this image, while powerful, is fundamentally limited. Any attempt by human imagination to express something beyond our comprehension is going to be limited. In reality, God, if we can conceive of a transcendent divine entity, would necessarily be vastly more complex and mysterious, and infinite being, far beyond any human depiction or concept. And this complexity introduces a fundamental challenge. How do we meaningfully connect or relate to something that is, by definition, transcending human understanding? In the same way that I think a majority of people think of God like they think of the Sistine Chapel, I think we've massively underestimated what a relationship with God actually looks like. The second element of relationship is interaction or influence. But interaction with God is not physical or even clearly cognitive in the conventional sense. It's subjective, intangible, experienced deeply within ourselves. For example, many people report powerful spiritual experiences, moments of profound awe in nature, deeply personal transformation during prayer or meditation, or sudden clarity in times of crisis or uncertainty. These interactions aren't measurable in traditional empirical ways, yet their influence is undeniably real. Such spiritual experiences shape individuals' values, emotional states, behaviors, and overall sense of purpose. Even though intangible and subjective, these experiences produce tangible results: personal transformation, renewed hope, enhanced well being, and deeper empathy. Profound influences on how we live our lives and relate to others. The third relational element, recognition of connection, also presents complexity when we apply it to God. In human relationships, recognition is often mutual and reciprocal. Both parties typically have some awareness of each other's presence. But when it comes to God, this mutual recognition becomes uncertain or even impossible to confirm objectively. For example, many religious traditions explicitly teach that God recognizes, knows, or even loves human beings individually. But philosophically and practically, proving this reciprocal awareness is impossible. Thus, a relationship with God may indeed be asymmetrical. We might recognize and relate to God, experiencing genuine connection and transformation, without ever knowing with certainty if God reciprocally recognizes us in a conscious way that we can understand. Yet importantly, relationship doesn't need to be perfectly reciprocal to be meaningful and transformative. As we discussed earlier, even one sided relationships, such as your emotional connection with a podcast host or AI, can be profoundly beneficial and enrich your life. Now, given these complexities, let's refine our definition to encompass these profound challenges clearly and meaningfully. A relationship with God might best be understood in three complementary ways. First is existential relationship. Simply put, our very existence implies a foundational relationship, creator and created. This existential relationship positions God as the foundational source from which life, consciousness, and meaning arises. And it's the one thing that we can be certain of, as we discovered in episode 1, the fact that we exist. Next, we have spiritual relationship. Interaction happens through spiritual practices, prayer, meditation, reflection, and personal growth, insight, and transformation. These spiritual interactions, though intangible, yield meaningful real world outcomes like emotional clarity, moral guidance, and purposeful living. And then finally, we have inherent divine relationship. Because I believe we are created in the image and likeness of God, something within us carries that spark of the divine, establishing an innate, ongoing relationship with the transcendent from within. And this profound internal connection grounds us in moral clarity, resilience, and a deeper sense of purpose, reminding us that our very nature reflects higher ideals and ultimate well being. In exploring this profound relationship, I align with thinkers like Jordan Peterson and Teilhard de Chardin, who perceive God as the highest ideal, toward which all meaningful human striving is directed. Peterson famously describes God not simply as a supernatural being, but as an embodiment of the highest moral good and purpose, something we align ourselves toward for greater well being and meaning. Teilhard de Chardin similarly frames humanity's ultimate purpose as moving towards a unifying omega point where consciousness, meaning, and divine unity converge. In both cases, the relationship with God isn't merely religious doctrine. It becomes an active, meaningful pursuit of personal and collective transformation towards something profoundly better, holy, and divine. Before we go further, I want to share where I'm coming from. I was raised in a Christian tradition, steeped in the stories, symbols, and communal practices of that faith. Yet over time, I've also come to embrace a trans-pantheistic perspective, one heavily influenced by Teilhard de Chardin's Omega Point. In this view, God is not only the transcendent creator, but also the immanent driving force towards greater unity, complexity, and consciousness in the universe. Not only that, but I think it closes full circle. And this is highly speculative, but it at least closes the loop for me and my scientific brain. If we work towards the omega point and we eventually create God and we become unified with God, and then God continues to grow throughout the universe, we'll reach the point where God will occupy the entire universe. And I at least have a brain cell in my head that says that it's possible that in pursuit of the ultimate complexity, consciousness, and unity of the universe, we'll eventually end up in the big crunch, such that we will create an entity that is so vast it will occupy the entire universe and pull it back towards a single point, which may, in and of itself, then create the Big Bang again in order to repeat the cycle that plays itself out over eternity. Now, this is highly speculative, and who knows if it's true or not, and there's no way to actually prove any of that. But it at least does make sense. It would explain why we have divinity built within us. It would explain why we're in a pursuit, and it would explain why we see an ever driving complexity within life towards that fight against entropy. So, combining these strands, I find myself believing that the divine both surrounds us and infuses our very being. We're made in the image and likeness of God, which I take to mean that each of us carries the spark of the divine within. This personal background shapes how I approach the idea of a relationship with God. It's not merely an external bound, but an inherent divine relationship, one rooted both in our human heritage and that cosmic journey towards the omega point, when humanity will create and be reunified with God. Now, again, that may sound a bit crazy, but I just don't see how it could be any other way, as our mere existence, as we discussed way back in episode 1, points us towards this destination. So pause briefly to consider. How do you perceive your relationship with something greater than yourself? Whether you label that as God, the universe, ultimate meaning, or purpose. How does your conception enrich your sense of self, meaning, and emotional well-being? I'm genuinely intrigued. As we bring today's episode to a close, let's carefully recap the key insights we've uncovered together. We clearly defined a relationship as foundational, not just to our social lives, but to our very existence. We explored the progressive layers of relationship from basic physical interactions through biological and cognitive recognition, emotional connection, and ultimately spiritual and transcendental relationships. We examined the foundational role of family and parenting and how these early relationships profoundly shape our emotional fluency, relational style, and overall identity. We considered emotional fluency as a critical skill for meaningful relationships, not just personal, but also within communities and societies. And finally, we reflected deeply on the possibility and profound impact of a transcendental relationship with God, exploring existential, spiritual, and metaphorical connections that can enrich our lives profoundly. In our next episode, we'll continue expanding outward from personal and family relationships to broader societal and cultural dynamics. We'll explore important themes like tribalism, gossip, the human need for a common enemy, and how these forces powerfully shape collective identities, group cohesion, and the meaning we derive from our communities. We'll also explore practical tools such as relational styles, attachment styles, and love languages to enhance our emotional fluency, helping us better understand what both men and women deeply desire in relationships and how these desires shape our interactions and our identities. As you continue reflecting on today's episode, consider the final question. How can my understanding of the foundational nature of relationships empower you to consciously nurture deeper connections within yourself, within others, and perhaps even within something transcendental or divine? As always, I'm deeply grateful that you're with me on this ongoing journey of meaning and purpose. Until next time, good luck on your journey. I look forward to our next encounter.